back and delighted to have with us today Dr. Tim Ball. He is the author of a very unique read. You might want to check this one out. Human-Caused Global Warming, the Biggest Deception in History. And Dr. Ball is, well, it looks like he is a converted soul. We'll talk to him about that. Dr. Ball, good to see you. Thanks for your time.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, wow, this is pretty interesting. Tell us your own story first. What happened to you?
Well, very quickly, I was born in England near Stonehenge, so I always put Druid down in the religious section of the government form. Never got called. But I emigrated to Canada, and I joined the Canadian Air Force. 4 years of anti-submarine in the North Atlantic, 5 years search and rescue in the Arctic. And what I learned from that was how lousy weather forecasting was. And I lost my flying category, and I didn't want to fly a desk. So I went back to university to get a PhD in looking at long-term climate and climate change, trying to improve weather forecasting and climate forecasting. And I thought this would be a nice, quiet, peaceful area with no controversy. But of course, it got turned by people using climate for a political agenda into a major global issue.
Did you ever believe them?
No, because I knew right from the start how much the climate changes naturally, and what's going on right now is well within natural variability. There's nothing unusual about it at all. And one of the things they did was that they being the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they narrowed the definition of what they were looking at to only human causes of climate change. Well, you can't possibly do that unless you know how much the climate changes naturally, and we don't. And most people don't understand. So, of course, that's why they were easily fooled into believing that they could claim, as they did in their most recent report, that human CO2 accounts for 95% of the temperature change since 1950. I mean, that is so ridiculous that I don't even know where to start.
You know what's so interesting about this, Dr. Ball, is that over the last several years, there was the appearance that those who were pushing human-caused global warming were winning the argument. But lately, more and more scientists are debunking the idea, and meteorologists, and the other side is being exposed. Where do you think this is going to go?
Well, my concern is that it's going to go where all great hoaxes go, in that it'll create skepticism in the public. You know, the environment was a new paradigm that we needed, and it started in about the 60s. We need to keep our nest clean. It doesn't make sense to soil your own nest. But these people that grabbed environment and climate for their political agenda took the moral high ground that only they care about the environment. And that's why I was so pleased when Trump said, look, we're going to limit the EPA use of regulations to control people's lives, but we all want clean air and clean water. And so what my concern is that, and this is not the only deception. I mean, when you look at Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, there's absolutely no truth to what she claimed in that book, and that was a major start of this attack on people and the environment and industry and development, that the public are going to say, look, we don't believe anything you tell us anymore, and therefore the old cry wolf syndrome. Right. And people that and things that we do need to deal with won't get dealt with. They'll get put aside.
You know what's so interesting about this? I will admit that I think it's made us better conservationists, and I'm
no
delighted.
Question.
Yeah. So I think we now see our moral obligation to this, and we've done good things to this. But to move it into our lives at such a regulatory level is now being rejected. And even the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, you kind of wonder where this is going to go and why the president's pulling away from it.
Well, he pulled away from it. And by the way, a couple of confessions. One is that I'm very aware of what the public understand and don't understand, because I taught a science credit for art students for 25 years. And almost every year I got the question, do you believe in God? And of course that speaks to part of what's going on here. But I was also invited to Washington a year ago, December, to work with the people that were scheduling the dismantling dismantling of the EPA. And so what my advice was, and it appears that Trump listened to it, was don't try and get out of the Paris Agreement on the basis of the science. You'll get beaten up so badly and so quickly that you won't know what hit you. But you can get out of it because it's a bad deal. And you're the president of getting out of bad deals. And part of the proof of the success of that was that Ivanka wanted to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement. And there were stories to that effect in the media. But what I understand is that once Trump sat her down and with other people and showed her how bad a deal it was, she came on board. And so that's the reason he got out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And of course, what he's done since, and this is why, by the way, they're attacking Scott Pruitt so viciously, because he was ready to go on day one to cut the regulations and cut the control that was the EPA were using to control people, industry, and everything else. And of course, that is why they've created these stories from inside the deep state, have created these stories of misuse of funds and pay increase and so on. This is all designed to undermine Scott Pruitt, who was right at the heart of the issue.
All right, so are more notable scientists and meteorologists beginning to follow what you're saying? And I mean, somewhere along the line, the science isn't supporting the data, but I guess we'll never expect the media to bring that forward. But the more and more scientists and meteorologists that begin to become honest with their research and their commitment of integrity begin to turn away from this, you see that growing?
Yes, but the reason that so many of them have stayed silent and on the sideline, because you've got arguments, false arguments, like the 97% consensus. The minute I heard that word consensus, I knew this was not about science. Consensus has nothing to do with science. And the other thing that's happening is that if you dare to question, and I challenge people, say, okay, tell your friends that you don't believe in global warming anymore or that humans are causing it, and see the violent reaction you get from some people who know nothing about what they're talking about. And I'm a living proof of the price you pay for daring to question, because I've had 3 lawsuits, all from the same lawyer, all from members of the IPCC, and the cost to me so far is $600,000 in defending myself against speaking out against false science. And so this intimidation factor. The other thing is, of course, that the left particularly are very good at marginalizing you. As you know, if you're losing an argument, you start to attack the individual. And so that's what they're doing with me. And I have 2 talents. One is they are not able to say I'm not qualified, although nobody ever asked Gore about his qualifications. The other is the good Lord gave me an ability to explain these things in ways that the public could understand. So that was the challenge against me. But the intimidation factor is huge. But gradually people will start to speak out, and you're starting to see that. The other thing I can tell you, Perry, is that a vast majority of the public know there's something wrong. They smell something wrong. They don't necessarily understand. And when you look at the polls, they're sitting on the sideline. They're holding back. So, for example, an almost 10 million people poll by the UN asked them about their greatest concerns, and they listed 16 of their major concerns. Climate change was dead last. Absolutely last. Pew Center poll, which of course tends to left of center, and they show exactly the same thing, that climate change and global warming is 32 out of 33 on the list of public concerns. So the public are just simply holding their voices because they don't want to get attacked or made to look stupid. But yes, there is a change going on, and of course, as you and I know, ultimately the truth will out.
Yeah, God has a way of doing that. Let me ask, Dr. Ball, let me ask you this. The rise and the fall of the temperature of the Earth, and even the meteorological patterns, they're cyclic, aren't they?
Well, this is one of the great debates that's gone on. Back in 1990, there was a conference of world climate, and the Soviets, as they were then, and the Chinese, they came and presented arguments that the climate was cyclical, because they have very long-term records, and they have always been involved. For example, the Kondratiev cycle, which is a climate-driven economic cycle, and anybody in the stock market knows about that. So they argued that the climate was cyclical, and all you've got to do is figure out all the different cycles and how they interact. The West was into chaos theory. And so they were arguing, oh, no, it's chaotic, you know. And I teased them. I said, you better hope it's chaotic. It might explain why your forecasts are so wrong all the time. And but the media, mainstream media, interpreted that scientific divide as a political divide between East and West, but it wasn't. It was a very genuine scientific divide, and so you've got this bizarre situation where, ironically, the communists were more accurate about the science than the so-called capitalist Christian West. But this is the craziness, as you know. Politics makes for strange bedfellows.
What is the motive here, Dr. Ball? Why the deception? Why the propaganda? What's it all about?
Very, very good question. Because once you realize the extent to which they've falsified the data and deliberately created a falsification, and I'll just read you one quote to support that. A German scientist, a physicist and meteorologist, he said, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. But to the specific answer to your question goes back to this here really isn't about global warming. All they wanted was, they being the Club of Rome, and the wanted a threat to the world where they could argue, look, this is beyond any nation's capability of dealing with it. So we've got to override nationalism, and we need one world government to deal with it. So, and the person behind that was a Maurice Strong, unfortunately a Canadian, and in a book called Cloak of Reen, when he was interviewed by Elaine Dewar, the author, she spent 5 days with him at the United Nations, and she said, well, you know, what's your view of things? And he said, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Now, why did he identify the industrialized nations? Well, the argument of the Club of Rome was that the world was, every nation and every person was using resources at a faster rate than was sustainable. So they published a book called Limits to Growth. And then they argued that to get started, they need to show that the biggest users of resources at a faster rate than anyone else were the industrialized nations, and they used fossil fuels to achieve that. So what they set about doing was to create science to show that the CO2, which was the byproduct of those industrialized nations, was the problem, and that was what they were going to use to shut down these industrialized nations.
Wow.
And just to conclude that, Dewar's, and by the way, she wanted to write a book praising these people. She found out they were more corrupt than the people they were attacking. Her conclusion after 5 days with Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. And of course, that's what you see going on with the Paris Climate Accord.
Oh, you're fascinating. Got to get you back. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, check out Dr. Ball's website, drtimball.com. More importantly, get a copy of his book called Human Caused Global Warming, The Biggest Deception in History. There's a picture of it there on the screen by Dr. Tim Ball. And again, his website is drtimball.com. Thank you, Dr. Ball. Thank you for your courage. I'm sorry you're being sued for being a prophet, but that's part of the cross you bear. I know that. And let's stay connected, okay?
Well, please, because there's so much more to talk about how they chose Darwin to defeat religion, and on and on and on. So yeah, so many things we need to talk about.
All right, we'll do some more visits, and may even do a series with you. Thank you, Dr. Ball. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Perry.
All right, God bless you. All right, again, his website is drtimball.com, and the book is entitled Human-Caused Global Warming, The Biggest Deception in History. There's a picture of the website and the book. Check it out. We'll see you next time on Focus Today.